My final tally came to $3.2 million, the amount my daughter Chloe and her husband Mark were legally ordered to forfeit after their business collapsed. I was supposed to be enjoying my retirement. Instead, I spent 3 years systematically dismantling the company that consumed my life savings and betrayed my trust. They thought I was a confused old lady to be dismissed. They didn't realize they had just insulted and financially threatened a woman whose career was built on the silent, systematic exposure of criminal fraud. They challenged the wrong forensic accountant. Hello, I'm Evelyn, and this is the most painful yet necessary story I've ever had to tell. Before we dive into the blueprints of this massive fraud, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. And if this story speaks to the power of overlooked wisdom, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You won't want to miss how I won this war. For 40 years, I worked with numbers. I'm Professor Evelyn Hayes, 70, a retired forensic accountant. My specialty wasn't just finding mistakes, it was finding secrets, the invisible strings of fraud that others thought they could hide. But when it came to my own daughter, I let my guard down completely. A forensic accountant should never trust her heart over her ledger, but I did. Chloe and her ambitious husband Mark came to me 2 years ago. They had a brilliant idea for a tech startup, full of buzzwords and promise. They needed seed money, a substantial sum, my entire retirement savings. I believed in Chloe's pride, and I believed in family. I happily transferred the funds, seeing it not as a risk, but as an investment in my daughter's future and my own legacy. For the first year, everything sounded perfect. But I saw the immediate subtle symptoms of financial distress, the kind of symptoms I used to flag for the IRS. They were living the lifestyle of successful founders without the actual success. My alarm bells finally started screaming when a small unpaid vendor called me asking if I could intervene on Chloe's behalf. I went to Chloe and Mark not with accusations, but with professional concern. I showed them the numbers and asked to review their foundational ledger. "Mom," Chloe sighed, immediately putting her hand on my arm, the gesture feeling entirely fake. "We don't need to worry about the books. We've got it handled." Then came the sharp betrayal. Mark stepped in, his voice suddenly hard. "Professor Hayes, we respect your background, but you've been retired for a decade. The tech world moves fast. Frankly, we think you're getting paranoid. We need you to stay out of the business now." He was suggesting in the cruelest way possible that my mind was feeling, that my expertise had turned into senility. Their insult, that I was paranoid and too old to understand their business, became the foundation of my revenge. I didn't cry. I got to work. I treated my daughter and son-in-law like a high-profile, white-collar crime case, and I was the chief investigator. In all my years exposing fraud, nothing ever hurt like realizing my own daughter saw me as disposable. My first move was to cut all personal contact, forcing them to communicate only through vague, defensive emails. This ensured I had a paper trail. I realized I couldn't trust any of the accountants they used. They were either complicit or too incompetent to see the crime. I had to build the entire case alone, operating entirely in the shadows. If Chloe or Mark realized I was auditing them, the consequences would be irreversible. I started my digital field work, using the skills I developed tracking down fugitives' assets, reviewing public financial filings and digital breadcrumbs like social media posts about their lavish spending. At midnight, with only the soft hum of my old desk lab, I mapped financial flows the way surgeons trace arteries. I began building a shadow audit ledger, a pristine,
physical document that synthesized all the external information I could find. I noticed immediate irregularities in their sales figures and inventory claims. I traced the purchase of Mark's luxury car. The massive down payment was routed through a complex series of holding accounts. The biggest discovery came when I tracked the remaining loan money I gave them. A massive transfer, nearly half the initial amount, had been routed through an anonymous shell corporation.
The discovery of the offshore shell corporation confirmed my worst fears. Chloe and Mark were not just burning capital, they were executing a deliberate, complex fraud to conceal the company's true, abysmal financial health. I realized they were billing phantom sales, the ghost account scheme, to inflate their valuation for investors while using the laundered money for their excessive personal expenses. I needed internal confirmation, something proving the fraudulent sales figures were deliberately created. I couldn't infiltrate their office directly, so I had to leverage my old network. I called Lisa, my former executive assistant, who was still working at the large accounting firm that handled Apex Dynamics. Lisa was fiercely loyal and hated the idea of financial crime. I didn't ask her to steal secrets. I asked her for public-facing documents that were easily accessible within the firm, like basic invoices and quarterly payroll sheets. Lisa risked her job and provided the documents. As I cross-referenced the payroll with the inflated sales figures, the truth became chillingly obvious. Apex Dynamics had only 5 full-time employees, yet their sales figures were comparable to a company with 50. The gap between revenue claims and operational costs was a canyon. I focused on the largest source of their funding, the original loan I gave them. I realized they hadn't just spent my money, they had leveraged my financial stability to secure more capital through high-interest loans, using my reputation as a retired professor as collateral. They needed to seize my remaining personal assets to prevent their entire house of cards from collapsing. This meant they were about to attack me legally. My shadow audit was nearly complete, proving the financial crime. But I needed proof of their intent to attack me personally. I knew they would try to claim I gifted the money or that I was too old to manage my affairs. I prepared for their legal move by setting up my own perfect counter trap.
I spent days analyzing their financial motivation, using the classic model I taught my students, the fraud triangle: opportunity, pressure, and rationalization. Their opportunity was the lax regulation around tech startups and my trust. Their rationalization was dismissing me as incompetent, mom's too old to understand. But the pressure, that was the key. I dug deeper into their loan applications. I discovered they owed millions to predatory private lenders, money that was used not for R&D, but to fuel their lavish lifestyle and pay off other debts. The pressure was immense and immediate. They weren't just running a fraud, they were desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. Mark executed their move just as I predicted. He showed up at my house with a lawyer, a young man who looked deeply uncomfortable, and a power of attorney form. "Mom," Mark said, trying to be sympathetic while his lawyer looked on, "we're just concerned. Your memory seems to be slipping. It would be easier for us to manage your finances so you don't make any errors." I played the role of the confused, compliant senior citizen. I asked slow, vague questions, giving the impression I barely understood the purpose of the document. "Oh dear, a power of attorney. Does this mean you can write checks for me, Mark?" As Mark patiently explained the document, trying to hide his impatience, I discreetly made high-resolution copies of the form and all the accompanying legal documents he brought. I did not sign them. I simply said, "Oh, I'll need to look at this with my reading glasses later, Mark. Thank you for your concern." My act bought me time and, more importantly, gave me the full legal paperwork they planned to use against me. I now had proof of their motive, pressure, their method, forgery or coercion, and the professional evidence of their crime, ghost accounts. The trap was set. Now it was time to deploy the unassailable case I had built. The time for silent investigation was over. I locked myself in my study for 3 days, synthesizing every piece of evidence into one irrefutable package. I treated the documents like evidence in a criminal trial. The resulting artifact was a thick, meticulously indexed binder, the final forensic report. It included the ghost account diagram, a color-coded chart tracing the movement of my retirement funds from mine account through the Cyprus Shell Corporation and into their personal expense accounts. The tax code violations. This section detailed the specific SEC and IRS regulations their offshore transfers violated. The proof of intent. Copies of the power of attorney forms they tried to coerce me into signing, proving their motive was to seize my remaining assets. I realized the immense power of the binder. Handing this to the police would ruin Chloe immediately, sending her to prison. But she was still my daughter. I couldn't bear to initiate that action directly. I needed the justice to be professional and regulatory, initiated by the systems designed to handle this kind of fraud. I contacted a trusted, anonymous intermediary, a small nonprofit that specialized in financial crime tips and protected whistleblower identities. I met the director in a neutral, public location. I explained that I was submitting a fully audited and verified report on massive corporate fraud and tax evasion, complete with all supporting evidence. I stressed that I wished to remain anonymous. The director was visibly stunned by the professional quality and volume of the evidence. He assured me the report would be submitted immediately and directly to the highest levels of the SEC and the IRS. My final, painful decision had been made. I had to ruin my own child to save my professional integrity and prevent Mark from collapsing the entire family, and potentially involving me in their crimes. The regulatory hammer was about to fall.
Executing the anonymous drop required the same meticulous planning I put into the fraud audit. I used a borrowed car, a disposable phone, and sent the final forensic report binder via a trusted courier service directly to the secure P.O. boxes for whistleblower complaints at the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Internal Revenue Service, IRS. I covered every trace, ensuring there was no analog or digital breadcrumb that could lead the investigation back to Evelyn Hayes. The silence that followed was unnerving. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Chloe and Mark continued their high-spending lifestyle, believing their coercion attempt had failed and that I was simply too confused to press the matter. Then, the first sign of the regulatory hammer. Apex Dynamics stock, which was privately held but traded among investors, suddenly halted trading. Their company website went dark. I watched the financial news closely and saw a small cryptic note. SEC opens preliminary inquiry into Apex Dynamics. Chloe and Mark were completely unaware of the source. They assumed the disgruntled investor was behind the tip. The atmosphere in my house immediately changed. Chloe and Mark stopped being arrogant and started panicking. The questions began to hit them from all sides. Investors asking about the trading halt and a specific, highly detailed letter from the IRS asking about the Cyprus Shell account. The letter contained questions that only someone who had traced the wire transfers could possibly know. They started tearing apart their own records, frantically searching for the source of the leak, unaware that the source was sitting quietly in the next room, knitting a blanket. The irony was beautiful. They were using their remaining stolen money to hire lawyers to defend a battle initiated by the woman they dismissed as incompetent.
The heat was on, and they were already beginning to melt. The heat from the SEC and IRS was turning into a blaze. The regulatory questions were so specific, citing dates, account numbers, and the purpose of the Cyprus transfers, that Chloe and Mark realized the source wasn't a disgruntled investor, it was a professional auditor. They started suspecting everyone, former partners, competitors, or their own accounting firm. The one person they refused to suspect was me. Their panic caused them to escalate their attacks on me, convinced I was the only weak link. They confronted me again, this time with aggressive desperation. "Mom," Chloe said, her eyes red from lack of sleep, "you must remember signing something that gave someone access to our books. Think, did you talk to an old colleague? Your memory is just fine, right?" They were desperately trying to coax me into admitting I had willfully done the leak, allowing them to frame me as a confused senior who acted erratically. I maintained my act, acting concerned but vague. "Oh dear, access to your books? I don't recall that, darling. I haven't talked to anyone in years. Mark, are you sure you handled the paperwork correctly?" My calm confusion made them doubt their own competence and fueled their paranoia. They desperately needed me to sign an affidavit stating I was mentally unfit so they could invalidate the transactions, but they needed the signature before the SEC raid hit. I knew the raid was imminent. I took a critical final step. I called my own lawyer, Ms. Hayes. I filed a preemptive statement of financial competence with a local notary, proving I was clear-minded during the entire 2 years of their operation and during my subsequent investigation. I ensured the evidence trail would lead directly back to Mark, while my mental state was perfectly documented and unassailable. I was building a shield for myself just as the storm was about to break over their heads. The morning the SEC raid hit Apex Dynamics was sudden and dramatic. Agents swarmed the offices, seizing computers, files, and freezing assets. Chloe and Mark were devastated, realizing their entire operation had vaporized overnight. They immediately tried to pin the fraud on me. Their defense lawyer, desperate for a scapegoat, claimed that all investment decisions involving my capital were made during a period when I, the main investor, was suffering from age-related cognitive decline and that I was the one who authorized the initial risky offshore transfer. The argument was simple: frame the old lady as the incompetent fool who ruined their brilliant business. But I was prepared. Ms. Hayes immediately filed my statement of financial competence, proving I was of sound mind during the entire investigation. More importantly, she presented the detailed final forensic report. The report, which traced the wire transfers and cited the tax codes, was impossible to dismiss. The evidence trail led back to Mark, who had executed the final transfer, and to Chloe, who had authorized the company structure. The final crushing moment came during the deposition. Mark tried to argue he had no control over the accounts, but Ms. Hayes produced the power of attorney form they tried to coerce me into signing. "Mr. Mark," Ms. Hayes asked, "if Professor Hayes was mentally unfit, why did you spend days trying to obtain her signature rather than having a court appoint you guardian? Weren't you trying to seize her assets after she discovered your fraud?" Mark stammered, exposed as the predator he was. My silent audit had created a defense so perfect it turned their best weapon, my age, into my ultimate shield. The case collapsed quickly. Facing irrefutable evidence from the final forensic report, Chloe and Mark were indicted for massive corporate fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. They lost the company, their assets were seized, and they faced severe prison time. The silence that followed was heartbreaking. I had won the battle, but I had lost my daughter. I sold the house I bought for them, now seized by creditors, and dealt with the public fallout with dignity. The media praised my integrity, calling me the grandmother whistleblower. My revenge was complete because it was purely ethical. I didn't pursue the emotional damage. I pursued the financial truth. I knew Chloe's involvement stemmed from her husband Mark's manipulation and her own blind ambition, but I could not save her from the consequences of her choices. I recovered some of my initial loan money through the legal seizure of assets, enough to secure my retirement and regain my peace. I handled the entire process with the cold, professional detachment I used on all my complex cases. The hardest part wasn't exposing the fraud. It was accepting the loss of my daughter. But I knew that if I hadn't acted, they would have eventually dragged me into their criminal network and consumed my entire future. I had saved myself, even if it meant destroying my family. 1 year later, the chaos was over. Chloe and Mark were facing the consequences of their fraud. My life was uncluttered and profoundly peaceful. I sat in my study, the sunlight warming the room, and looked at the final forensic report binder one last time. It was a monument to my competence. I filed it away in my fireproof safe. The true cost of the audit wasn't the time or the money. It was the realization that trust should always be verified, even with family. I funded a new charitable foundation for financial literacy using the recovered funds, a legacy built on integrity, not fraud. I decided to spend my retirement exactly as I wished, without the burden of deception or fear. I looked back at the incident and realized the crucial victory. My age was never the problem. My meticulous planning, which Victor and Chloe dismissed as paranoia, was my ultimate saving grace. They thought they could outrun the law with their digital tricks, but they couldn't outrun the woman whose entire career was built on the simple truth that numbers don't lie, but people do. My most important audit was the one I performed on my own family. I protected my future, restored my ethical integrity, and proved that a retired professor, even at 70, is the most formidable opponent imaginable. Never too old for forensic justice.